Well, hello again, my friends, and welcome once more to the Invisible College. My name, as you probably already know, is Adrian Gilbert, and we've been going now for about 2 years, I think. It's time is moving onwards. Anyway, this lecture I'm going to do today, I had originally intended to only do it for the members of the college, but I realise it's so important that it really needs to be put into general release. And I'll be doing another lecture for them later on in the week. But yes, I think this is one that needs to go out much wider than I'd originally anticipated. So it's really about what is this college? What is it all about? And I think you have a right to know that right from the start. Some of you might be considering whether to join properly or not, through Patreon. Quite a few have already, and it's growing fast. But some of you are probably wondering, thinking, yeah, well, I just want to know a bit more about it before I join it. And I don't blame you at all for that. I would be exactly the same in your situation. So I think I owe it to you to say a bit more on that. And how do I see myself within this context? Well, to answer that, I want to talk a little bit about something called Rosy-crossianism. And now I'm not talking about the people in Long Beach, I think it is, in California, who advertise in magazines, and you do mailing courses, but probably all online these days, I suppose. And they will teach you all about the mysteries, and the secret chambers and all of that. Well, it's nothing to do with that. I'm not involved in it in any way at all. It's more an attitude of mind and of life, really. But it begins with someone who called himself Christian Rosy-cross. And he was a German living in the 14th, 15th century. And the story, there's a legend that goes with him. And the story goes that he was brought up, he was an orphan, he was brought up in a monastery, and he learned everything he could, from the monks. And then he went, to the universities and tried to learn as much as he could there. And he realized he'd reached an impasse, that he wasn't getting any further, and he wanted to know more. So he thought, and the only thing he could think of to do, which is what people did in those days, was go on pilgrimage, go out to Israel, and, well, they didn't call it Israel in those days. They called it Palestine, I think, or just the Holy Land, and see if he could find himself teachers and find some knowledge there. And the story goes that he got shipwrecked in Syria, and he went to Damascus. And of course, Damascus is famous for its roses, or certainly was then. And there still are Damascene roses. They used to plant roses among the grapevines and the flowering fruits to attract bees. So that was, of course, they also used to make attar of roses, which is the essence, which they put in Turkish delight. I don't know if people eat Turkish delight these days. We had a lot of it when I was a kid. There weren't that many sweets around then, and it was a real delicacy. But leaving that aside, Damascus was famous for its roses, and he did find knowledge there. He found people that could teach him, and he went further on to, I think he went up to Constantinople and to North Africa, and he found out from the Islamic world a lot particularly about healing. A lot of things that weren't known in Europe at that time. Europe had been through the Dark Ages and into the Middle Ages, and a lot of the traditional knowledge of the Egyptians and the Greeks and people have been preserved in the East. And he came back with this knowledge, and he thought, oh, right, I'll go back and I'll tell the teachers and the churches and the Archbishop, and they'll all be so excited. They'll want to know all about this, and we'll cause an instauration of knowledge, resurrection, a restoration of the knowledge of the West. And of course, once he went back to Germany, no such thing happened. They weren't going to listen to him. Who was he to come and tell them, the wisdom of the East? Who was he? This upstart, this heretic, perhaps, telling them. So he went away very despondently, but he did meet up privately with certain people who did want to hear his message, and they formed a brotherhood of the Rosy-cross, as they called it. Now, I'm not saying I'm a member of the Brotherhood of the Rosy-cross, but I've followed the similar kind of path to him. And I actually did go out to Israel on pilgrimage looking for knowledge. And I have found knowledge en route and on the way. Some of it in Turkey, some in Egypt, some in here in Britain, particularly in Wales, also some in Scotland and in America. I've found knowledge and I've pieced it together to form a set of ideas. Now, I was originally going to share these ideas with you in the form of specific courses, like they have in universities. You can study a course in this, a course in that, a course in the other, and putting them all together, you get your degree. And I thought, then we'll end up something like that. We'll have the same picture. Everyone will know the same thing. They'll all be instructed in this, what I've found, But then I realised that's actually not a very good way of doing things. This picture comes from a jigsaw puzzle that actually my wife is doing at the moment. You see it here, and you can see the pieces of the puzzle. And you'd be much better off, I realised, if we do these lectures and so on separately, like the individual pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, and you put it all together yourself, along with other things that you probably know that I don't know. You've probably studied things I haven't studied, I'm certain. You build your own image, your own picture, as it were, which will be appropriate for you. And that actually is the true Rosicrucian way. I'm not sure there ever was a person called Christian Rosenkreuz. And if there was, that's just a pseudonym, His name was probably Johann Sebastian or something, really, if he existed. But it certainly was a movement. And that movement came to its fruition in the 17th century. Around 1614, some pamphlets came out, first of all in German and then in other languages, French and Italian and English and Dutch. And these pamphlets were talking about how the New Age was being born. Stars had been seen, new stars in Cassiopeia and in Cygnus the Swan, that signified this new time that was going to happen. And there was going to be new knowledge. And now these brothers, these Rosicrucian brothers, were coming out of hiding, and they were going to initiate other people and show them the way. And there'll be this new instauration, this reformation, as it were, of religion and science and knowledge, this sort of leavening of everything in the coming in the 17th century. And of course that's exactly what did happen, but not quite the way that they were expecting. The authorities, just as the time of Christian Rosenkreuz, weren't at all interested in this, and in fact they tried to hunt down the brothers. Who are they? These heretics, they've got to be burnt at the stake. They've got to have their heads chopped off. We can't have this. So they had to keep their heads down. But certain people did come out and speak openly and very warmly about them and claim to be Rosicrucians themselves. And one of these was, if I can find him, this gentleman here, Robert Flood. We've been talking about some of his work in earlier lectures. Now, he was living in England, and England at that time was a Protestant country outside of the reach of the Catholic Church, which particularly wanted to burn these guys at the stake. And he had the sympathy of Queen Elizabeth and her court, who were also very interested in all this material. So he was able to get away with it. And in the time of James I, he brought out various books, which we've been looking at some of the pictures from them. And he was an alchemist and a philosopher. And he's actually lived in a village not all that far away from where I live. And I've been to the church where he's buried, and his bust is there, and things about him. They hide it away behind a curtain because they're ashamed of it now. Yeah, Robert Flower, doesn't fit with the church. Well, he was a big benefactor of that church, and the local one of the local dignitaries, landowner. So anyway, he's a great man, and he called himself a Rosicrucian, and he gave us this image with of the rose. It's on a cross. It's growing from the cross, and it says "Dat rosa mel apibus." The rose gives honey to the bees, and you can see a beehive on the right-hand side there, and on the left-hand side there's a trellis, and it's got a spider's web threatening to catch the bees. So it's kind of a symbol relating to the world and to the work of the esotericist to give honey to the bees. The bees come and collect the honey, or they collect the nectar from the rose and take it back to the hive and ferment it, where it becomes honey, and they can then feed that to the young bees. So that's kind of what a symbol for anyone who's doing the real esoteric work, as he was, establishing the beehive in England at that time. So I'll just read out what I've written here. A true Rosicrucian does this. Honey symbolizes wisdom, and this is the fermented nectar of knowledge that is food for the soul. Robert Flood claimed to be a Rosicrucian, and indeed he was. His extraordinary works were true alchemy. They contain nectar that even today can feed the souls of those open and willing to learn. So this is the true esoteric teachings of Christianity that grows out of the cross. The rose is growing out of the cross, and it's giving nectar, wisdom, to the young bees. So he was what I would call a true Rosicrucian, although I wonder if he ever met one of these people who had published the pamphlets. Maybe, but he didn't need to. He was one himself. And another one here, Michael Mayer. He was a German who came to London for some of the time, and then he went back to Germany, and unfortunately he got killed, caught up in the terrible beginnings of the 30 Years' War, and he died in 1622, I think, well, I don't think it was actually in Bohemia. I think he was in Germany at the time, which was also a major centre for new thinking in those days. And I've written a lot about this, actually, in my book. I'll show you here. It's book Blood of Avalon. I've followed a lot to do with the Rosicrucians, not just the ones in the 17th century. You can see the symbols of them, the rose, the cross, and it's showing there the crucified rose, or the rose growing out of the cross. But also there's a lot in Wales, and I believe some of its origins were actually in Wales. And also emblems like this, the Lady of Penshurst with the cross with the Virgin Mary behind it praying. That's actually in Penshurst Church, which is, again, not far from where I live. So this, I think, is what we should be looking at, is that the true Rosicrucians are not necessarily a physical brotherhood on earth. There is a brotherhood of the Rosy-cross, but it's actually in the unseen worlds. And we can imagine that some of these people were actually connected in some way. They're initiates and were inspired from unseen worlds to write their books and to do their information. And there's another gentleman I want to show you as well. um, which is George Gurdjieff, G.I. Gurdjieff, who was an extraordinary man, half Armenian, half Greek, who grew up on the borders of Turkey and Russia. And so he was born under the Turkish Empire, and the Russians conquered that part where he was living in Kars. So he came under the Russians. And so as a result, he ended up speaking a number of languages. He spoke fluent Russian and Turkish and Greek and Armenian. And he learnt other languages too. I think he knew some Persian, and probably some Arabic. And then, of course, he learnt French and English later on. And Italian, I think, as well. I mean, he's a great linguist. Anyway, he started a school in Moscow originally in 1914. And a famous guy called Uspensky, Peter Uspensky, who was his most famous pupil, came across the school and joined it and recorded a lot of information about what he was taught. And together they both left St. Petersburg, left Russia, Moscow, and went to Georgia, to Tiflis, or Tbilisi as we call it today, on the Black Sea. And then they went from there to Istanbul, and Gurdjieff proceeded from there to Paris, and he set up a school at Fontainebleau, a place called the Prieuré. And Uspensky came to London, and he started a school here in London. And many people who studied with those two carried on their work, starting schools of their own, and are still going on today. But I don't believe they are genuine esoteric schools anymore. That what happens is that you have someone like Gurdjieff, who was clearly a master. Now, I should say, like Christian Rosenkreuz, he went off searching for knowledge in the East. Now, he was well placed to do that because he came from, as I say, the borderlands of Russia and Turkey, and he spoke Armenian and Greek. And he went sort of searching, and he found a brotherhood he called the Sarmun Brotherhood, or Sarman. And it seems to be a brotherhood of Persian Christians that continued, and who still had certain knowledge that they had preserved in secret that wasn't known generally to the West. And so he brought that back, partly in the form of sacred dances, but also in certain teachings about astronomy and other things like that. And he also he claimed he had done an early journey where he went to certain parts of southeast Turkey, and there's a lot of mystery about exactly where he went to. And I worked on that, and I worked out that the places that he went to, in particular, was somewhere called Nizibis, which is right in the corner, southeast corner of Turkey, where it connects with Syria and very close to Iraq. So I went down there to take a look, and I found what I believe to be the place that he stayed at. And I also concluded that he must have travelled back. He said he went from there to Egypt directly. Well, you can't go immediately. You have to move across through parts of Syria and Turkey to get there. And I believe he went to somewhere called Urfa, Sanli Urfa. And I found certain information there in my travels. And I've written about that in my book Magi, if you're interested. Anyway, so this guy, I believe, was a real teacher. He had connection. But after he died, they carried on the form of what he had taught them, repeating what he had taught them. But I don't believe any of them really made the connection themselves. And Uspensky in particular, he says he turned away from the work after 4 years because it was becoming too religious. And I think he was a pretty skeptical scientist. I won't say he was an atheist quite, but he was certainly very, didn't like that side of things. He was very intellectual in his mind. And that put a block between him making the full connection that I believe Gurdjieff had with higher levels, as it were. So anyway, so I thought I'd share these ideas with you so you know where I'm coming from, that I believe there have been people teaching the truth right through history, and even before these guys, even before Christianity. Connections with Egypt and connections with the Grail mysteries and the story of the Knights Templars, and all of these things are all manifestations of the same tradition, which flowers like a rose. It comes up and it flowers briefly, and then it goes back down, dormant again, comes up again somewhere else. Maybe gets persecuted and destroyed, but will reflower. Hence the symbol of the flowering cross, the Rosy-cross. So this is what I'm aiming for. This is what I'm aiming to do, to share with you what I've found. I haven't found everything, of course not. And there will be things that you will find, I'm sure. But I want to share with you, while I'm still here on Earth, what I've found, because I'm an old man now, and it's time to pass on the torch to other people. And the other thing I wanted us to make clear is this is not a cult. I saw what cults do back in the 70s. With my own eyes, I saw what cults can do and how they destroy people's lives. Not just the people who follow the cultist, but the so-called teachers or gurus, whatever they want to call themselves, with the flowing robes and the long white beards and so on. Very corrupting on them as well. And that's not the path we're following. What we're going to do is, or what I'm going to do is pass on certain knowledge to you, like a mountaineer he's been up the mountain and now he's come back down. He's going to show people how you use the bits and pieces, the ropes, the crampons, the nails, etc., and how you approach the mountain to climb it. But for you, you're going to have to climb it yourself because nobody else can do it for you. So I hope you find that interesting. Just a short little lecture, and I thought I'd just spell this out. I'm going to do another one later this week for the members of the college. So thank you very much for your time, and we'll speak to you again.